Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Silloway. I'm the Social Policy Director for the League of Women Voters of San Luis Obispo County. Thank you for attending this edition of the Lunch with the League. We're really excited to have you here, and we're excited about our presentation today because we have really great information coming up for you. We're going to be recording this session and post it on our YouTube channel with a link from our website in 2 or 3 days. So find it again there and send it to your friends. This is going to be important information. A couple announcements and housekeeping things before we get started. We have another important webinar coming up on September 30th. This is another Lunch with the League. We think you're going to enjoy it. The title is Who Can Afford to Live in SLO County? And if you're not already here, that's not very many people. It will explore the widening mismatch between the cost of housing and people's ability to pay for it. And it will look at the costs that that mismatch imposes on all of us. We have an expert panel of the top affordable housing developers in the county, including Scott Collins, who's the executive director of the Housing Authority of SLO County, Damian Mavis, who is a co-founder and principal of Covelop. It's a private for-profit developer that works with affordable to design housing, and Ken Triguero, who's the CEO and president of People's Self-Help Housing. The moderator is going to be Michael Foote, very experienced in this field. He's the director of economic development and community affairs for REACH, which is a Central Coast consultancy. So you can register for this website on our webinar on our website and save it to your calendar for Monday, September 30th at noon. When you're on the website, take a look at the other events that are coming up. We have a number of things that may be interesting to you, including community forums, information on civil discourse. It's good stuff. Go take a look. Okay, a couple of housekeeping things. If you want to ask questions, use the Q&A function. The chat will be disabled for the audience, so Q&A is the only way to reach us. We can take the questions at any time during the webinar, but we will not be addressing any answers to those until after the presentations. So put the questions up as soon as you have them come through your head, and then wait until you get the answer. We're scheduled to end at 1 p.m. That's our typical noon to 1 slot for Lunch with the League. And we'll try to keep it to that time since it is your lunch hour. But if we have good questions that are going on and our presenters are willing, we will run past a little bit, maybe as late as 1:15 for a hard stop. So you can, of course, leave whenever you want. Now, it is my honor to introduce our presenters for today's session on how will we live tomorrow. The important topic of social housing is one of the promising models we have to build housing for workforce households that will remain affordable over time. We're truly excited to have two of the most knowledgeable people in the country with us today. Jennifer Lassar is the founder and CEO of the Global Policy Leadership Academy and the Lassar portfolio of firms, which work together to grow thriving, healthy, and vibrant communities. Anu Natarajan is the managing director of global housing practice, Global Policy Leadership Academy. She is a subject matter expert, a leading expert in our country on social housing. So Jennifer and Anu, take it away. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and good afternoon, everybody. Anu and I are pleased to be with you. So as Glenn said, I'm Jennifer Lassar. I'm the founder and CEO of the Lassar portfolio of firms, of which the Global Policy Leadership Academy is one of them. And Anu Natarajan is our managing director of our global housing practice. I'm going to start our presentation today and walk you through the agenda and introduce you to our firms. And then I'm going to hand it over to Anu, who will do the majority of the presenting on social housing. So our presentation is entitled, How Will We Live Tomorrow? This is borrowed from a worldwide forum that Vienna, Austria hosted for a number of years on social housing. And we just think it's so apropos of where we are today in California. How are we going to live tomorrow? How will we all afford to stay here, live here, raise our families, and grow old here? This is a park in Vienna, Austria that we visit with the delegations that we take. Next. So our agenda today is going to take you through really looking back in time at yesterday. How did we think we were going to live? Where are we today? And where are we headed? Again, I'm going to introduce our firms and then hand it over to Anu, who will talk about Vienna's social housing model, staying involved and facilitate in our discussion. So we have been in business almost 20 years, and over that time, our practice has just really evolved from being a management consulting company, which is what LaSar Development Consultants is. We write counties' housing plans. We underwrite housing projects for cities. We work on housing elements, things that you would know to be very part of the everyday work of government. In the Global Policy Leadership Academy at the top, this is really what we're bringing to you today. This is our transformative learning company, where we engage with peer-to-peer cohorts and have transformative learning opportunities together. And then LaSar Support Services is our firm where we run programs nationally and in California, all supported by the LaSar Holding Company at the bottom, where all of our infrastructure sits. So there's no wrong door into our firms. It just really depends what kind of experience you're looking for, what kind of services. Next. So I want to just talk about the 4 things that the Global Policy Leadership Academy does. We are engaged in uplifting the sector capacity of the housing and homelessness sectors in California. And as such, we engage in a lot of different types of training work, mostly done through local government. Second, in the second column, we run an annual Housing Policy Leadership Academy, which is about 40 hours, and it's kind of a housing 101 that helps leaders across California, again, civic leaders, elected leaders, developers, financiers, philanthropy, understand all aspects of housing, from the regulatory process to what it means to build a movement of people to pass housing policy. So very, very diverse. We run housing policy boot camps twice a year, generally around understanding what the state's done legislatively for the year. We do that in the fall, and also often in the spring, what happened in the Congress in the prior year. And then lastly, and before I turn it over to Anu, twice a year, and in 2025, this will be in April and in September, we take delegations of 30 to 50 people to Vienna for a 5-day study of the Vienna social housing model. We've taken cohorts since 2022, so about 200 people in the first 5 cohorts. And that's something that Anu and I do together. And we are continuing to evolve it. So Anu, I want to turn it over to you to talk about where we are in California and what's going on in Vienna.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the League for giving us the opportunity to talk about something that both Jennifer and I are passionate about. What I will say is that we have 30 minutes to talk to you about what we convey in 5 days to our delegates. So it's going to be a broad overview, but really giving you the opportunity to understand the model and then get into a deep dive in our Q&A session. So Jennifer set the context. We're talking about yesterday, today, tomorrow. So going back to California in its glorious yesteryears, it was the California dream that got a lot of people moving here, including a slew of immigrants, all in the hope of living in paradise with the opportunity to work hard and prosper, and probably the ability to dream big and be audacious in their goals. And central to this dream was owning your own home, a sanctuary that afforded you the ability to live inside, outside, taking advantage of the climate, and really becoming part of that community that they all wanted to belong in. Next. So we don't have to tell you all where we are in California today. The opportunity to build that healthy, thriving community is in jeopardy. Thank you. There's a shortage of homes for every income level, and everything that we love about California is being threatened. Again, in poll after polls, you've seen numbers where a predominant amount of Californians talk about housing affordability and homelessness as the big issues that we need to deal with. And for the League and others involved in the democratic process, housing is probably the key to activating the power of California's young voters who are especially vulnerable and feel the impact of the lack of housing and the housing crisis today. Next. Again, I'm not going to take too much time to talk to you about numbers. I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of it, but we've had a persistent housing crisis caused by 40 years of bad policy. We are severely lacking in meeting the housing needs with our production goals. And as you all are aware, the housing element update cycle 6 and the RENA numbers provide that stark need. The number of housing units that are needed in this cycle is double what was needed previously. So there is this persistent housing crisis, both in terms of affordability, but also in terms of the supply of housing. What is needed is not tweaking at the edges of a system that is broken, but really a bold new vision. At the federal level, you've heard of the Green New Deal, which talks about social housing and other ways of looking at our housing crisis and solving for it. In California, the governors talked about redefining our California dream and how we can and must reanimate the California dream, building a California for all again. And lots of advocacy groups that are really talking about how we get to yes on all housing and yes to affordable housing. And that's where GPLA comes in. As Jennifer talked about, GPLA really does work at transforming at the systems level, looking for bold change, looking for big change that takes a lot of collaboration, takes a lot of partners to do this together. And so our focus is really expanding and building those networks of people that are already in this field, people that want to solve these problems and are committed to creating an equitable, sustainable community for all in California. And how do we do this? By building a culture of collaboration, learning from each other, and providing mechanisms and tools to accelerate that positive change that we all want to see in our communities, in the region, and in the world. Next. So what we are looking for is creating a platform to move forward the collective impact that is needed to make the changes that we so deserve. Our goal at GPLA is to address the housing crisis in California by looking outside of California, in fact, looking outside of the US for successful strategies. One of those is the social housing model. And looking at a social housing model in Vienna through an immersive educational program. And we do this by using what we call the 5P framework at GPLA. The 5Ps, as you can see listed there, are producing housing for all, preserving vulnerable housing, promoting equity and inclusion, protecting our tenants, and preventing displacement. And through this collective work, the impact that we want to see both in the short term, the medium term, and the long term is to enable California's housing stakeholders throughout its ecosystem to transfer relevant global knowledge and practices in applying those insights and lessons learned to our California context by crafting policies, by creating innovative financing models, and really looking at pilot projects that can help us look at a new way of dealing with this crisis. Next. So what is social housing? One of the things that Jennifer and I and the team have long conversations about is should we or should we not use the term social housing because there's so much stigma attached to that term. But we believe that we need to really start using that term and also talk about what it actually means and what it doesn't mean. It has become a buzzword in the last year or so. And in the 5 years that we've been studying social housing, this is probably the most it's been talked about. But there's also a lot of misinformation about what social housing is. We've heard from some of our delegates that it's Soviet-style housing, which it's not. We hear that it's the basis for socialism. It's not. So what social housing actually is an intentionally planned and developed mixed income neighborhood or mixed income community. It's public sector or government owned, and it's regulated to be permanently affordable. The housing security is through permanently rent-restricted houses. It prioritizes high-quality affordable housing, not just to address the crisis for the poor, but includes the middle class. And it's not influenced by market-driven price fluctuations. So these are the fundamental tenets of what social housing is. Next. So let's focus on Vienna and why we chose Vienna as a model for studying social housing. In 1918, Vienna had 30,000 homeless people and almost 300,000 people living in slums with really unhealthy conditions in the middle of an epidemic. People came together to address this crisis. The leading groups were homeless tenants, women who had just earned the right to vote, and labor unions came together to create what was called the Vienna Housing Coalition. And what they did was put together a whole slew of policies, demanded to get financing for it, and built 65,000 units of housing in 5 years. That was in 1918. They also instituted a lot of tenant protection policies at that time. And since then to now, for the last 3 to 4 years, Vienna has been voted the most livable city, using more than 30 factors, and consistently coming up on top as the most livable city in the world. And just as an FYI, no US city has made the top 10 on that list. Next. So what is Vienna's approach to housing? Again, what we want to make sure to understand is Vienna has a successful model, but it's built over 100 years of lessons learned and, as Jennifer talked about earlier, constantly rethinking what is needed for the future. So Vienna believes that housing is a human right, that everybody deserves a home, and that it's the government's role to provide housing options for all. So they play a very significant role in providing choices for housing, both creating the infrastructure that's needed to provide the housing units, having a permanent source of funding, and prioritizing infrastructure investment, and people-centered planning to build those inclusive and sustainable communities. What is probably most interesting about Vienna's approach is also this integrated and interconnected housing system with a single point of entry. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a little while. Just some basic statistics to ground us. Vienna's population is close to $2 million. Just by comparison, LA is 3.9. Total housing number of units is 1 million to 1.384. But what's interesting is the publicly owned affordable housing units. Vienna has 220,000 plus, that's 21 to 22% of their entire stock of housing. California, I'm sorry, in LA, it's 0.5%. Moving to total affordable housing units, 39% of their housing stock, or 405,000 of the housing stocks, are totally affordable. In LA, it's 70,000, which is 5% of its affordable housing stock. And moving to unhoused population, Vienna has 0.11%. In Los Angeles, with 41,000 plus unhoused neighbors, is 1.1%. So just to give you a comparative analysis of where Vienna is, and to help translate some of the ideas to California and to some communities within California. Next slide. So 60% of Viennese residents live in social housing. They spend less than 30%, so 27% of their household income on housing. There's effectively no homelessness, as we saw in our previous slide, and absolutely no housing insecurity, because they have the options and choices to move within a system that's been built to provide choices for all. New construction, infill, and housing preservation elements really provide those choices to all of its citizens and residents. And there is a built-in path to homeownership, while rental properties are the predominant system of housing, there is a path to homeownership if the Viennese choose to buy those housing units. Next. So coming back to a Vienna field study, we've done 5 trips in the last 3 years. We've taken over 197 delegates from California, predominantly from Los Angeles, the Bay Area, San Diego, Fresno, Inland Empire, but we've also had people that are interested in joining us from Portland, New York, Hawaii, and now Virginia is interested in joining the event. So there really is a wide range of folks that want to join the field trip. And the cohort is put together and curated by us to make sure that we have diverse perspectives, that we are busting the silos, and that this really is an opportunity for peer-to-peer living, learning, where people learn from one another. So our cohorts have elected officials, public sector staff, developers, folks from philanthropy, advocacy, education, healthcare sectors, and social services. We've had faith leaders. We had a fairly large contingent from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and we also have public affairs and journalists join us in these study programs. It's all about learning together. So it's a 5-day intensive program. We start off on a Sunday with a reception, bringing people together and orienting them to the week ahead. And then the days are divided into conversations and discussions with the Viennese, and understanding their ecosystem in the mornings, and spending the afternoons really taking a look at the communities, doing site visits to understand how some of these projects have been put together, but how they also have evolved and thrived over time. It's also talking to residents to understand from their perspective what they like and what they don't like. And some of the amazing things that we learn in talking to the Viennese about how proud they are, have this really strong sense of pride and a strong sense of belonging in the places and the communities that they live in. So today what I'm going to do is really condense those 5 days of learning into the 5P framework that we use to walk through the extensive and the 100-year history of Vienna social housing. So again, to go back to the 5P framework, it's produce, preserve, promote, protect, and prevent. And we'll talk about the Viennese social housing within the context of these 5 elements. So in the production space, as I mentioned earlier, the city does take a very active role in acquiring land, in providing for a permanent source of funding, regulating, managing, and incentivizing housing. They use a developer competition to get the best ideas, to control prices, and to expedite and streamline the whole approval process and get developers interested in building those houses. They build between 5,000 and 10,000 homes per year, which is enough housing to meet the local demand today and a projected demand with all of the immigrants that are pouring in from Ukraine and other places around them. Again, this is something that we want to stress again, is that social housing includes the middle class, which is a huge shift from how we define affordable housing here in the United States. $440 million is generated annually and dedicated for public sector use related to housing initiatives. And this includes 85% of that funding going towards new construction and renovating existing housing stock, and only 15% of it going to support preventing homelessness. There's a broad diversity of housing types. In Vienna, again, social housing is not one kind of housing. In Vienna, you've got all of these different housing types. You've got the municipal housing, which is built and owned by the city of Vienna. They own up to 220,000 units of housing. While a lot of Europe sold the land and the housing stock to private developers, Vienna chose to hang on to their housing stock, to their land, and have a really robust supply of housing within the municipal housing model. There is also what is called the Limited Profit Housing Association, and that is called also referred to as the non-market housing. So you've got the subsidized municipal housing, you've got market rate housing, and the third sector is what is called the limited profit housing association, where costs are contained, and developers take a fee, a given percentage, which is capped, for the work that they do in building these units and managing them. So we could talk a little bit more about limited profit housing association in our Q&A, but that is something that is a financing model that we are very interested in terms of translating that potential idea to California. Within the housing that's being built now, just quickly, there's also called smart units, which are really small units that cater to students and people that don't need too much space. So they're affordable by design because of the size, and it enables people to get these entry-level units. Vienna also does a very good job with different kinds of ownerships, the cooperatives, the co-housing living, community land trusts. They are invested and are focused on supporting different and alternative kinds of home ownership. And also does a very good job of introducing additional density, additional housing units on top of existing homes, really creating those additional units through a gentle density without changing dramatically the way the neighborhood looks. And they also have temporary emergency housing for people that do fall through the cracks and are in need of supportive services. Next. The next P is preserve, and Vienna is designed, its social housing is designed to be permanently affordable. The city takes measures to preserve housing, which is could be at the risk of being converted to market rate housing. As we said, they own a fairly substantial amount of housing stock in the city, and the Gentle Urban Renewal Project also preserves the quality of Vienna's housing stock by upgrading it and making it more energy compliant, so that it's up to today's code and standards. Next. So what does Vienna do in terms of promoting the social housing model? Probably the biggest one is what they call their social mixing policy. So this policy is intended to integrate households from different professions, backgrounds, different ethnicities. And this is done very consciously using the social housing model, especially because 80% of Viennese qualify to be in the social housing projects. And so it pulls in people from various income spectrums and are integrated into living in the same communities. The other interesting thing that Vienna did in 2018 was to introduce a zoning category called social housing zoning, which requires developers to designate 2/3 of any housing that's built to be permanently affordable. So 1/3 could be market rate, but the 2/3 has to be permanent affordable housing and part of the social housing stock. Vienna has also been very good about, Vienna has also been very good about intersectional planning and integrated planning to promote livability, mobility, and sustainability. And as we said, while they do a really good job of providing rental housing for all, they also want to make sure that there is an option for home ownership in its housing stock. Next. In terms of protection, they have a robust set of policies and programs that reduce evictions. They have rent control, open-ended leases, and probably a very interesting fact is also that these houses, even if they're rental, can be transferred to the heirs and with the right of ownership. And so they do a good job of making sure that there is stability in the housing and in the communities that that people live in. The city supports the tenants through programs and services that are offered. That includes leasing assistance and legal support. And a needs-based system of allocation for lower income units makes sure that people don't fall through the cracks and that people that have a need, people that are homeless, are part of the system and score extra points in how the allocations are made. Next. In all of these policies and the way the ecosystem is structured of the different organizations and entities working together really focuses on preventing homelessness, prevents people from being displaced, and making sure that families continue to live in the houses that they're part of, in the neighborhoods that they belong to. The income verification, unlike the United States, where it's done every year, is done once at the time of entry into the social housing system and never done after that. And the rehabilitation of apartments, the older stock, is done in such a way that it minimizes displacement and people have the ability to move back into those units once they're upgraded. Next. So for us at GPLA, we are looking to continuously innovate our curriculum, update it to meet the needs and demands of what's happening around us. And as we learn more, we want to make sure that we continue to refine and update the curriculum. So two of the things that we're going to be focusing on next year and weave that into our curriculum is really looking at social determinants of health and how Vienna does climate resiliency and sustainability in all of the work that it does. And it's not a siloed climate action plan. Next. So GPLA has been in the news. The Guardian ran an article last year about the delegations that we had done, and also taking a look at some of the lessons learned and the impact of some of our trips to Vienna. And as Jennifer said, I think the conversation's been great. There's some movement here in terms of making change. But what we are fascinated with each cohort is when people come in, they're skeptical about a system that functions in a completely different system politically and in a whole host of other ways. And the ability to transfer something like that into California. I mean, we've got naysayers who continue to argue that there's nothing in Vienna that can work in our system. And by the end of the 5 days, as Jennifer likes to say, we've got people that move from skeptics to being somewhat inspired and wanting to be part of the change and the bold, big changes that we need here in California. Next. On the last delegation in July, we had the honor of having Tamika Moss, who's the California Secretary of Housing, Business, Consumer Services, and Housing. And she was part of the largest delegation that we've had with over 55 delegates. And she came away totally inspired with Vienna's approach to housing, that housing is seen as a fundamental approach. And in her mind, she was inspired to take what she calls an abundance approach, even within the limited resources that we have in addressing housing needs across California and across the entire continuum. At its core, as she says, it's about people and community. It's not just about housing, but it's about what people need to live well. And that is a transformative idea. Next. So lessons learned for us. What can we do here in California from Vienna and what we've learned about the way they do things there? For us, we've learned over the last few years how much public land we have. So we can optimize on using those public lands for housing and building at scale. Restoring the government's role in infrastructure development. As all of you are aware, when we lost redevelopment, we lost the tool to get the infrastructure done, to put in money in areas that need improvements. And so to restore government's role in that infrastructure development, to ensure that we have a permanent source of funding and that we have a simpler capital stack so we're not having our affordable housing developers jump through hoops to make development happen. We've got 2 new regional housing finance agencies, BAFA in the Bay Area and La Casa in Los Angeles, where we have the ability to try some of these new innovative models and use those two regional agencies that have the ability to raise funding and financing and have the ability to land bank. Plan and build for the middle class. I think that's something we have not cracked yet in terms of addressing that issue, because we've had to deal with the level of investment that's needed in addressing our homelessness. So I think really taking a look at how we build for the middle class in our mixed income communities is going to be important. Providing and promoting alternative housing models instead of simply the single family home as that California dream or the American dream, and creating new housing narratives. When we see the pride that the Viennese have in the housing that they live in the communities that they live in, that is something that we need to get to. And to get to yes for all forms of housing, we need to really be talking about and creating a new housing narrative. Social housing progress in California. LA has done a ballot measure and raised funding, and some of the components that they want to do are inspired by what they saw and learned in Vienna. As I talked about, La Casa is interested in looking at a pilot program based on some of the Viennese approaches to housing. We've had at least 3 legislators, Assemblymember Lee and Senator Skinner and Wahab, who've been talking about social housing and have bills under progress dealing with social housing. Next. So the need for change is not something that is even questioned now. Everybody understands that we absolutely have to change the way we do things. When we look at Vienna and the park Jennifer described when she opened the session, versus what we see in most cities in California. We need to be looking at tomorrow. We need to be looking at bold change. We need to be looking at pulling in all the stakeholders, everybody that's interested in creating change, to be rowing in the same direction so we can make that happen for Californians today and tomorrow. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer to talk about our upcoming field trips and wrap up.
Thank you, Anu. So as I shared, we go twice a year. We go in April and in September. The weather's nice in both of these times. And again, we take 30 to 50 people. We like to take people in clusters. So that might mean a cluster of people from a community, like we've taken a cluster from Culver City. As an example, it could be a cluster of people with a similar professional background. So again, as Anu said, we took a number of people from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. We like to take clusters of philanthropists. We like to take clusters of civic leaders and community leaders. So if you all are interested, best to come as a cluster, 3 to 5 people, because it allows our cohort members to come home and have a group of peers to continue to work on advancing these values and these opportunities. And then in our very last slide, you'll see the QR code is the QR code that takes you to our website. So on behalf of Anu and I, thank you so much for letting us present. And Anu, there are questions that I've been answering.
Great.
But I think probably best to turn it to you and give you, I've been answering them in writing, but to give you a chance to answer some of them live. So can you, Anu, see the question and answers?
Yes.
And actually, let me ask one for you from our host who can't be in the Q&A, but one of the questions from our host, Anu, is how are developers incentivized to build 2/3 of the units as part of the social housing model, which, as you've said, is permanently affordable?
So there's a few things that Vienna provides in terms of making it easy for these developers to build the social housing model. One, they have public land that they provide to the developers. 2, they go through a fairly rigorous developer competition process where they develop stringent criteria that's judged on 4 different factors, including how you deal with sustainability, the economic feasibility, and innovative ideas that you come up with. social mixing and how that's factored in. And because the developers are fairly clear on what they need to do and can come in being able to take risks and don't have to just do the same cookie cutter developments, there's been some real innovation in looking at sustainability and incorporating that into the way things are built. So one, free land; two, very clear direction on what's needed. And three, they are partners in this. So it's really a public-private partnership in how the housing is built. And four, the approval process compared to what we have here in the US, where the developers don't even know what's going to happen at the end of a long, arduous process, is something that's done very cleanly, it's streamlined, and the city makes an effort to make sure that the communities around where these projects are built are pulled in fairly early in the process and become supporters of these processes, and it's not challenged as people move along. Anything that I missed out, Jennifer?
No, I'm just going to add to that and answer one other question that came to us privately. So I think, as Anu said, Vienna land banks for a 15-year supply of land. And one of the sources of land for them is the repurposing of property from non-residential to residential and mixed income uses. So one of the communities we see is a repurposed train lines where they've moved their rail, and it's a very long community of about 5,000 or 6,000 people that follow it. An old rail line has a long linear park through it. The other community that we see is the repurposed airport. That's going to be a community built out for about 30,000. It's practically a new neighborhood. And so in all of those communities, the developers, as Anu said, go through a stringent development process, and there might be anywhere from 50 to 100 buildings or more, right? So many different types of housing, student housing, co-owned, cooperative housing, things like that. One of the questions was, how do you organize the rent schedule so that people can live of different incomes can live in the same buildings? All that's baked in the underwriting, and like here, many buildings have a small sliver of lower income, but some buildings are just naturally more affordable than others. And so the affordability is baked into the overall community.
Jennifer,
yeah, please.
If I could just add one more thing to that earlier question of incentives. The city takes care of a lot of the infrastructure and actually getting it built. As Jennifer said, when they look at large projects, they make sure that there's transit connections and investment in transit prior to the housing actually getting built. So you're not having the investment in infrastructure done in the backs of developers. Parking, again, is looked at because you've got a very robust transit system and a public transit system that's cheap, reliable, that you don't have to be building these parking garages, which add to the cost of the projects. And so there's just a whole host of factors at very different scales that are coordinated and to keep the costs down and to make sure that the projects continue to be affordable. Thank you.
There's a question about pride of ownership or pride of rentership, or how is community created. I'm going to take that one. I know there's another one in the Q&A for you about the different players. Maybe you could look at that one while I answer this one. So one of the things about Vienna is that social housing is a system for which there is civic pride. And there's a pride to live in mixed income communities, and there's a pride that everybody's housing within a building looks the same. And so you might be an architect and you might live next door to somebody who might live in a smaller unit, but in your very same building might have been exiting the criminal justice system or domestic violence, or might be a recent immigrant. So part of social housing is that it's a value of Viennese society. And then the city also has a very rich social safety net, and part of the social safety net is making sure people don't fall through it. It's why there isn't homelessness, but also the city works to cultivate community, and in new communities has social workers who really go out and program the communities and community activities to help residents get to know each other in the beginning. I know maybe I can ask this question of you, but the question was, can you speak to how the different players, national and local government, developers, finance, etc., collaborated or determined the different roles that let this framework be successful in practice?
One of the slides that we didn't include just because of the lack of time to go through it is how extensive and connected the ecosystem of housing in Vienna is. So to answer your question, the federal government is responsible for collecting that 1% income tax, which goes to housing. Vienna is a city state, so it has the ability to create policies and make sure that housing for the social housing continues to flourish. And over the 100 years, it's never been a political issue. It's not a rights issue or an issue on the left. It's just been a fundamental right. And so I think just given how they approach housing, they've been able to really move forward collectively to do this together. A lot of what they do is also public-private partnerships. So the city is responsible for the municipal housing, but as we talked about with the limited partner profit housing model, they actually have created these organizations that are public and private with oversight from the community to make sure that they're all aligned in what they need to do. Who else is part of it? It does have the local government that not only is responsible for planning, the transit agencies that work with them, the folks that look at smart climate city Vienna and come up with really innovative sustainability models that need to be incorporated, all the way to working with developers, market rate developers. There's an association that is called the limited partner, I keep saying partner, limited profit housing model. And there's over 157 organizations that are part of that. And so that's a group that works with them. The Chamber of Commerce is involved, but what's also interesting in Vienna is they have this organization called the Chamber of Labor. And that's an association that works on behalf of its workforce. And one of their goals is to make sure that their workers, that their membership has housing and housing choices. So that group has its own research wing that's also included. They work with the universities to look at creative models to make sure that they're studying best practices around the world to keep innovating and moving things forward. The question about how will we live tomorrow was part of an exercise that they did with the International Building Association, or the International Building Exhibition, a 7-year process where they all came together to talk about what worked, what hasn't been working, and what they need to renovate to keep moving it forward. So it's intersectional, it's integrated in terms of all of the different components working together, and they make it seamless, but they really work hard behind the scenes to make it easy and accessible.
And I know I would just add that these are beautiful communities. They're just stunning. They look different than our planned communities here in the United States because there are so many different architects and types of architecture, but they're very dynamic. And they use a lot of wood and they use a lot of color. A lot of it is at a scale that I think many people in California would be comfortable with, anywhere from 4 to 6 stories, a lot of it. So a lot of central walkways that might have little coffee shops and things. Again, they're walkways, they're not for cars. So a big part of the process there is very smart planning from the built environment perspective, but also, again, the climate resiliency. Anu, I'm going to take this question on who goes on the trips, and then there's a question in there about the political spectrum that I can read for you. So one question is, so far of the people who've gone on the trips, what percentage are U.S. private development, building industries beyond housing authorities? So Anu and I curate these trips. They're intentionally curated to match the diversity of the housing ecosystem. So you saw large concentrations of folks from LA or the Bay Area or San Diego. We're really starting to get more deeply into the Central Valley and the Inland Empire. So when we say come in clusters, we put together clusters within the cohorts, but for us, an ecosystem is representative of all of those people that Anu listed from our, and we're really looking for change makers. So the developers are 10, 15% maybe of a trip, as are philanthropists or as our community activists. So every trip is meant to be inclusive of the diversity of voices that are needed to move change. So we do this work. We take people because we believe in California, we are desperate for new solutions. And so we, again, are looking for people who can make change. And that's really, that's incumbent upon who goes and why we ask people to not come by themselves. So again, everybody's at the table. And for people who don't want to be at a table with the inclusive ecosystem, you shouldn't come. And we also really ask people when you come, please suspend trying so hard to layer on your American values onto this system. Instead, please be open-minded to look at what are the values of this system and what can we adapt back to California and to the United States that could work here. And the fundamental difference is their commitment to building communities that include helping the middle income, and to building diverse communities that people opt in to living economically in economically diverse communities. That is not our way here, right? People self-select into sort of the highest income community that they probably can afford in general. Let me ask Anu, just read this one for you to respond to from one of the questioners. One end of the political spectrum claims that the other end wants to put people in racked and stacked boxes. Is there also a response that can shift the perception of this? Is there a political, also there is the political challenge regarding biases against mixing different types of people in terms of incomes. What are things we can do to shift our culture?
I think part of the way we've set up our housing system is it's market rate. That's the American dream. And social housing or subsidized housing is only for people that can't afford the housing unit. So there's a stigma attached to this term affordable housing. So we've made this a black and white issue. If we start looking at including housing for the workforce, including housing for that missing middle or middle income, it changes the whole conversation about who lives in affordable housing. And politically, we've stopped bringing out the fact that our single family homes are the most subsidized form of housing in the United States. When you talk about subsidized housing, these conversations about not understanding who lives in those communities. So it's incumbent upon all of us to really humanize what affordable housing is, to talk about who actually lives there. It's our kids that need those homes. It's not someone from someplace else that's going to bring fear and change and issues to our communities. So it's really shifting to, as Tamika said, an abundance approach instead of looking at how we create these trade-offs between one end of the spectrum versus the other. Bridging silos between advocacy groups who are focused primarily on each lane of the affordable housing crisis, only focusing on getting housing, getting revenues for homelessness, are only focused on the extremely low income. Yes, those are critical and we have to do it, but we need to be looking at the entire spectrum of housing so we prevent middle class families from wanting and needing and adding a burden to the homelessness crisis. How do we change the narrative? I think it's a hearts and minds campaign. I mean, we've been talking extensively about how we talk about housing. And to your point, yes, I mean, when you talk about, what was the term you used? Racked and stacked or pack and stack. I mean, that provides an imagery of housing that failed in this country, public housing that wasn't maintained well, that wasn't built well. to really taking a look at how we talk about these, how we talk about the values and the value systems, and how, I mean, and the minute you start talking about um, affordable housing and housing for the middle class, you can see a shift in how city council conversations happen across our different cities. Everybody says, oh, I want to build housing for our public sector, public safety folks. I want to build housing for teachers, but I don't want to deal with homelessness because that's going to ruin the property values in my community or my neighborhood. So really busting those misperceptions by getting people with lived experience to not only talk about these issues, but to help us in decision making is how we change the conversations. And taking people on these trips to Vienna and having conversations like this that the League is putting together about different models, about how people live differently in different parts of the world that can resonate here. I mean, when we have some of the young delegates that go to Vienna and see the kind of living that can happen and so affordable, they come back in tears because they know they deserve the same thing that the Viennese provide, and we're not doing that here. So I think it's really promoting and shifting our narratives from policy to numbers to not discussing these as units of housing, but homes for people, and humanizing this whole crisis that we start to change minds.
Anu, I think just to add to that, a really important part of the Vienna system also is housing tenure. So here, if you live in low-income housing and your income
Yep.
goes up, you have to move. There, they've taken away home ownership as the only viable option for housing security. That's how we view home ownership, the chance to control our unit and to invest in our unit. In Vienna, once you qualify into the housing, they never check your income again, whether you're low income or middle income. And that unit is yours in perpetuity, and you, in fact, can basically pass it on to your children. You can bring your elder aging parents into it if you want. So they build housing that you don't have to own, that you still have a sense of control over. And we only celebrate homeownership here, and homeownership is largely unobtainable for a good majority of Californians and certainly most of our young people. So part of it is a value around community, the quality of place, the accessibility of transportation, and this strong idea that you can control your destiny in the communities that you live in without having to be an owner. So again, we think that that is also really replicable here. If we just would decide to get rid of the income recertification and recognize that, like healthcare and like education, housing is part of the social well-being infrastructure that we all need to be able to access and enjoy.
There's a question from Elaine about surveys to determine satisfaction of the people that live in these units. They constantly have surveys and conversations with the residents in Vienna to make sure that any of the issues that they have are being addressed, but also proactively to take a look at what's working, what's not working, and how things can improve. So this is something that they've done, that they continue to do constantly in Vienna.
There's a comment about workforce housing, and I think I would say generally we hear the comment more around distinguishing between affordable housing and workforce housing. I think the Rob makes a good point about we're not trying to imply, if we use the term workforce housing, that lower income people aren't working. We're really just trying to create accessible, affordable housing for people at all levels in California, including the market, right? Including people who are at the top of our income levels, middle class. So really, we're just trying to produce housing for all. And it's an important point about trying not to bias or at least explain our terms better. So social housing, again, is housing for all. It's generally 1/3 low, 1/3 middle, and 1/3 market, all in planned communities that are anywhere from a few thousand units to upwards of 6, 8, and 30,000 units, depending on just the opportunity that the land presented. Anu, I think we're actually about at time. I don't know if our hosts want to come back on. I think we've also managed to answer almost all the questions. So Glenn might ask for a little guidance from you, but I think we've gotten to most of it.
Sorry, I can't get my video to stay on for some reason, but thank you very much. These questions and answers have been really helpful, as well as your presentation. I believe that you have agreed to we have recorded this, so will we be able to distribute the PowerPoint separately if people want to put it on our website?
I think we'd rather just the PowerPoint be seen through the video. It really is our property and we use it as a talking
Okay,
platform
yeah.
around the state.
We didn't get that clear in the beginning. So people, that's a good incentive for you to go look at the webinar again, because you can look at those slides carefully and learn more.
Yeah.
Thank you. We will be presenting again Lunch with the League on September 30, a local webinar with our main affordable housing developers, and moderated by Michael Foote. Please sign up. That's on our website. You can sign up. And if there's nothing else, I'm going to say goodbye for now and thank you. We will have a screen up for you for a while for information on contact and so forth with Jennifer and Anu, as well as us. So once again, thanks. We'll see you again for Lunch with the League. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.